Now, starting from the very center, let's just talk about the sun for a second. Okay. The sun is shrinking. It's doing so at a rate of about 5 feet per hour. And given the distance that we have between our Earth and it, they would have been touching as recently as 20 million years ago. So the whole 4.5 billion years ago, Earth formed, that kind of nonsense.
Yeah, because then the sun would be too big. It would have melted Earth.
It would have destroyed it. And, if there was anything left of it, it would have been clear that it was once completely molten, which they said it was, but the problem is there's no evidence of that.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the It Stands Written podcast. My name is Braden and I have Gavin in front of me today. In this week's episode of our Creation versus Evolution series, we're going to be talking about astronomy. We're titling this episode For Signs and Seasons. And astronomy looks at and studies planets, the solar system, stars, everything outside of the Earth's atmosphere. And Gavin, you're going to take us into that and show how complex it is and how undeniable it is that someone created that.
Yeah, not just that it was created, but that it was actually created recently. And of course, if anybody hasn't listened to the podcast that preceded this one, the age of the Earth matters for a few reasons, but one of them is that it's what evolution needs as its magic ingredient to make the case for itself, because it happened apparently long ago and far away. You can't see it happening. You have to believe in it, right? Yeah. Of course, it contradicts the Bible. It's not really supported by the Bible. It's not really supported by popular opinion, maybe, but only just barely sometimes. And even in the scientific community, it's hardly favored. Not to mention, a consensus isn't how we make decisions in science anyways. It's based on observation. And so for someone to say that a scientist believes this doesn't mean anything. Okay, so I'll find you another scientist who does not believe that. But for as long as it exists in the realm of belief, we're not going to call it science. We're going to admit that it's just faith.
Right.
And there's a lot of good reasons that our faith should point us towards believing in a young Earth that was created by God about 6,000 years ago. And I think the strongest evidence we find for this is in the realm of astronomy. Earth is technically part of that, right? It's just, of course, the most studied, best studied planet because we're right here and it's easier to do than things that are far away. But we'll talk about that. But before we get into all the particulars about it, I want to talk about the universe. If you recall, universe is a Latin word meaning single spoken sentence. And God said, let there be. That's where that came from. He's taking credit for having made this. So there's really two theories about the existence of the universe. You could say one says that there was a beginning. That's consistent with what the Bible says. And another says that it has always existed. For example, steady state theory or something like that. The trouble is each of these things would have a problem on their own. One of them has a problem, the eternal one, no matter what, really. But only with God is there a way for this to be possible. So if we look at eternal existence, one of the problems we have, Einstein pointed it out, is that if there were an infinite number of events required to get us to the one that we're at, we'd never make it here. Right. We couldn't get here yet. So he was actually a proponent for the idea that time moves at a certain speed. It might be incredibly divisible, but nonetheless, it had a beginning point or we never would have made it to the particular one. Now, the other problem is things are cooling down, out in the atmosphere, out in outer space. And as they do so, they can't just do it forever. There comes a point where you're finally cold and that's it. You've reached the bottom. But there's lots of things out there that are still warm, extremely hot in some places, and shouldn't be if, in fact, they've had eternity be cooling off. Now, if we go to the beginning idea, that is true, but it only works with God. If you were to say that the beginning came a moment after there was nothing, and here's the start point, the clock begins, you have the time-space continuum come into existence, you have a bit of a problem here because nothing, if it ever truly existed, would have stayed nothing forever, and nothing could have ever existed. There's nothing to act upon it. Interesting thing, you'll find an interview on YouTube between Ben Stein and R.C. Sproul. Well, Sproul was still alive. Ben Stein had directed a movie called No Intelligence Allowed. And I think there was more to the name than that, but you'll find it pretty easily. And in the interview, Sproul actually talked about a discussion he had with Carl Sagan, who was famous for writing The Cosmos and was sadly a terrible atheist and a loud one at that. And Sagan sat there with him discussing this idea of the Big Bang. And Sproul said to him, look, he says, you're trying to tell me that for millions and millions and billions and trillions of years, there was nothing. But then one day on a Wednesday, at 2:43 p.m., everything just came into existence and exploded. He said, you understand science. And he said, you know the laws of this. He said, you know that something that's at rest will stay that way unless, of course, it's acted on by an external. And he said he sat there and wouldn't finish the sentence. He said, force, Carl, you can finish this. He says, you're trying to tell me this all came from nothing? No, there was some external force that acted on it to create what we have here.
Yeah.
So biblically, it's completely consistent with what we see. There was a beginning, and God did it, and he deserves credit for it.
Yeah.
One of the other things you can look at, we won't talk a whole lot about stars today, but when a star explodes, they call it a nova. Depending on the size of that explosion, they might call it a supernova, but it refers to the destruction of one. Okay. And you can look around and see remnants of these all over. And there's, upwards of 10,000. Okay. What we've never observed is the formation of a star. Okay. Lots of stupid theories that compete with each other on how it could happen, but none of them have been substantiated because it's easy just by looking at each one to say, here's the problem with this one, try another, here's the problem with that one. You can go in circles all day. There is no theory about how this could possibly work that fits anything in science. We've never observed it, but we have seen them destroy themselves. They appear to be burning out. And what's interesting is, since we have, roughly 10,000, we'll just keep with that number for a second, and we can determine how quickly this occurs just kind of on average, what we've observed, we can say, okay, well, let's just roll the clock backwards. When did they start blowing up? And you come to a conclusion that this didn't begin until about 10,000 years ago or less. Again, consistent with the Bible, it's 6,000, but, if anybody wanted to use the math without the Bible, they'd come to a very close answer, right? So there's lots of evidence for a young Earth, and a young universe for that matter. Another theory out there says that the universe is something that has popped into existence and the Big Bang has happened repeatedly. So at one point, everything condensed into a small spot, and then it exploded and expanded out. But eventually, slowly, gravity pulled it back together. I think I was actually taught this one back when I was in school. And one day it'll happen again, and it's probably preceded us trillions and trillions and trillions of times. In fact, it would be ad infinitum. So it's really just another eternal existence theory. But one of the problems is, if we go back and talk about the redshift, which we covered on an earlier episode, the redshift is the idea that some of the light is stretched as though it's speeding away from us. Okay, these objects are speeding away. And some are coming towards us, some are going away. But in some distant areas, in fact, usually in the more distant areas, we'll find that they are speeding away from us. The thing is, they tend to be accelerating away. And if they're accelerating away, and that's true, then they're never going to come to a place where they halt and then reverse course and come back to where they started. The idea is this is a one-time thing. God's just showing off. And the whole idea of an expanding universe, again, is a little bit odd because it implies that there's an edge to this thing when there's not. We all know that it just goes on forever. And of course, that's only possible if it was created by an infinite God. Right. We have no quarrels with the reality of that. What's interesting, though, is when you talk to people about this and say, I believe that God brought it into existence, and then, of course, their response is that they believe that there is no God. They ask you to say, where did he come from? They ask you to explain that to them, right? Where did he come from? And they say, look, we believe that we exist from nothing, by nothing, and for nothing. We just exist. So tell me where God came from. And I think, you hypocrite, I'm telling you that he just exists. In other words, it's okay for you to do it, but not for him. Right. Where do you get off saying that? You don't realize that I'm saying God just exists. And you say, no, I just exist. How can he do that? I don't know. But if you just exist, stop trying to, steal the privilege from him. He created you. Okay. This is just hypocritical. God did not create the Big Bang. Some Christians say it seems like his handiwork. Well, it didn't happen. Okay. His handiwork is all around us. We can see it, but there's no evidence that it came by anything other than his spoken creation. There's all kinds of violations in the Big Bang that contradict what the Bible has to say about how things work. So anyhow, we're going to talk about where the solar system came from. We're not going to be by any means exhaustive on this tonight, but we'll talk about probably the most prevalent of the theories. And our solar system was allegedly, through the evolutionary theory, created through what's known as the solar nebula model. Okay, and at some point you just have to use your imagination here because that's what evolutionists are good at. We'll try to go down this rabbit hole with them. There was this large disk of spinning gases out in the middle of nowhere, which is where we live, apparently. Okay. And towards the center, some of these things came together and began to get very hot and created what is known as the sun. This is a problem all by itself. Okay. When you try to push gases together, guess what? They push apart. Try adding compressed air to a tire. It becomes hot, or those kinds of things, right? You compress gases and they try to push back apart, but just ignore science and what you're, accustomed to, because, long ago and far away, a fairy tale actually happened and the sun came. Okay. Don't question it. All right. So the sun comes about, it gets very hot, and the gases that are swirling around it stretch out into different areas and become our current solar system as we know it. And the evidence for this, they might say, is that, towards the centermost region, which would include our terrestrial planets, Mercury, Venus, Earth, Pluto, a couple of these, you say, well, these are kind of rocky things that could probably stand up to the heat closer to the sun, whereas volatile things that boil off easily would go towards the gassy planets would be farther away. And if you stand back and look at it, you go, hey, lo and behold, that fits the theory. The other thing that fits it is that they're all moving along a rather flat plane. And if you had this spinning accretion disk, whatever they call it, that would be what you'd end up with. And they say, well, there you have it. The problem is that this is hardly an explanation for how things came to be. There are a million problems built into it. We're just going to kind of go through them one at a time. To begin with, they're saying these gases came together, created the sun, and after that, the gases came together to form dust. Okay? They actually have been able to demonstrate at least this much in some vacuum environments and tests that you can get gas to kind of stick together a little bit in places and get very small things like dust. And that dust can accumulate with other dust, but it doesn't get much larger. And if it could, the largest it could possibly get would be about the size of a pebble before you run into a huge problem. Now, mind you, remember, this is on its way to becoming a planet, but right now we're at the pebble phase. The problem is a pebble is something that's relatively small. And if it were to aggregate by the description I just gave it, you'd know that it's not densely packed yet, right? It's not hand packed like a snowball, but it's just very light, okay? And it lacks density. So what happens is as these things collide with one another at this size, they just break one another apart.
Right.
They become more small pieces, little globs here and there, but they don't become bigger. And this is where there's a huge gap in the next step where we become what they call planetesimals. We'll just call them asteroids. That's what a planetesimal just means a small planet. So they have this huge gap between where you get from there to the planetesimal, but just use your imagination. Somehow it happened and there's no God and you can just go about your day feeling good about your sin. Okay. Beyond that, the planetesimals become all the planets that we know. The Bible says, for the invisible things of him from the creation of the world are clearly seen, being understood by the things that are made, even his eternal power and Godhead, so that they are without excuse. Okay. So if anybody's listening to this and says, I choose to, ignore these things, God's saying, yeah, I know you're making a choice here. You're without excuse. He's aware. That's Romans 1:20. Now, starting from the very center, let's just talk about the sun for a second. Okay. The sun is shrinking. It's doing so at a rate of about 5 feet per hour. And given the distance that we have between our Earth and it, they would have been touching as recently as 20 million years ago. So the whole 4.5 billion years ago, Earth formed, that kind of nonsense.
Yeah, because then the sun would be too big. It would have melted Earth.
It would have destroyed it. And, if there was anything left of it, it would have been clear that it was once completely molten, which they said it was. But the problem is there's no evidence of that. There's certain rocks that if you melt them, turn into rhyolite, but there's no turning them back. And if we have these other rocks that preceded it, I think limestone, someone double check me on this. I don't care. The point is we have evidence here that we were not completely molten. Right. So we would have been touching. That's a little bit of a problem. Not to mention it would have boiled off the water pretty quickly. And there's tons of it here.
Yeah.
All right. Now, the closest planet to the sun is Mercury. Okay, and Mercury is not a place you'd want to visit like pretty much anything else in the atmosphere in the entire universe other than where we're at. The surface of it fluctuates in temperature depending on what portion of it is facing the sun. On one side, it's 800 degrees, and on the other, it's negative 200. Okay, just from being that close. That's the effect that it has on it. It is a little bit larger than the moon if you compare them side by side. And we visited this thing a couple times. First, back in the 70s, the Mariner 10 space probe visited it. More recently, it was visited by the Messenger mission. Okay, and they found some interesting things there. One of the first problems is that as they approached it, they realized this thing was extremely dense. How did they know? Because it started sucking in the Mariner 10 space probe. It's pulling on it. Okay. And they go, wow, this has got quite the gravitational field. In fact, it's the second densest thing we found other than the Earth in our solar system. Well, that's pretty amazing because it shouldn't be like that. See, if the nebula theory is true and all these things just, coalesced in the manner that they claimed they did, this thing being small shouldn't be packed as densely as it is. There's not enough, gravitational pull on any of these molecules to end up where we are.
Yeah. Okay. And quick, just for the listeners, those who don't know what nebula theory is, can you give just a brief explanation of what it is?
Yeah. So the nebula theory is the idea that there was a spinning gas cloud that created everything. And because of its shape, we can kind of say, well, it looks like we might have been part of some circular, early, you might call it a primordial, if you will, accretion disk. And so that's what they're referring to, the idea that it all made itself without God's intervention.
Got it.
Yeah. So we visited this thing and the gravitational field is tremendous. We know that it shouldn't be this dense because it's just too small to be. This thing appears as though it were hand packed. And I would say that it probably was. Yeah. Right. This is the hand of God working on it. And so what they say is, well, this doesn't fit the predictions we had with our evolutionary theory. We've got to come up with some kind of a hypothesis that would explain it away. So there's no evidence for this, mind you. They have to come up with evidence that would explain away the creation perspective actually taking the lead. Yeah. So what they came up with something known as the large impact hypothesis. And anytime you read about this, just know that it's going to fill in the gap for virtually every problem that they can come up with, every problem they have, rather, with creation that we don't have any problem explaining. What is it? Well, pretty simple. Okay, the large impacts hypothesis says that something long ago and far away, some kind of an asteroid, came flying at this object and struck it, and that would explain why there's a higher density than there should be. The only evidence that this didn't happen, of course, is that if it didn't happen, creation would be true, and we just can't live with that. Right? Now, if you look at the thing, you might go, well, hold on. If it was hit so hard, why does it stay the course? Why is it still making almost such a perfect circle, right? Most of the stuff out there is doing that. They're not just huge ellipses. These are almost perfect circles, many of them. Okay. And Mercury's doing that. There's no evidence that it was struck by anything. Mm-hmm. The other problem is when they flew past this thing, they said, this thing has a magnetic field, but it can't have that. Because if it did, it would be young. Well, how do we come to this conclusion? It's pretty simple. There's really two theories on how magnetism exists in planets. One of them is the dynamo theory, which says that you have a core that's some kind of a molten liquid iron, and it's swirling around, creating the magnetic field that we have. The thing is, those can't just do it forever because they cool off like everything else. And over millions and millions and millions of years, a little tiny planet like that should have cooled off eons ago.
Right.
And they say, well, this is surprising. Well, no, it's not. It's not surprising at all if you read the Bible. It's surprising to you because you're trying to find something else.
Yeah.
It's going to be surprising when you're judged too, sadly.
Yeah.
Now, the other thing is they say, well, hold on, there's got to be some workaround for this, right? There just has to be. Sure. They say it might be remnant magnetism. Okay. Remnant magnetism means that when the thing was formed, it had magnetism initially, and it would last for a while after. That's a young Earth argument right there. Yes, I would say that's probably the reason it has it, is because, in fact, it's young and it still has some remnant magnetism from when God made it about 6,000 years ago. No problem. Mm-hmm. But they say, well, we can't really live with this one either. So how about we say this? When it was struck by something that brought it some sulfur, perhaps, because if you mix sulfur with it, now you'd be able to extend its magnetic field longer. That's possible, but again, you're hoping that this thing that just took perfect aim at it brought all the right things. And what's interesting is there actually is sulfur on the planet on the surface. There's also potassium up there. The trouble is they shouldn't be there. Why? Because like I said in the very beginning, the planets that are forming closest to the sun, all the volatile gases, sulfur being one of them, shouldn't be there. But it is. Mm-hmm. Okay. None of this makes sense. If you think that these things were created on their own, there's no explaining away what God did. He left sulfur there as evidence that nebula theory was dumb. That's the only reason he did it. I can't think of any other.
Yeah.
Along those lines, it says this right here, 1 Corinthians 1:27, but God has chosen the foolish things of the world to shame the wise, and God has chosen the weak things of the world to shame the things which are strong. God made things out there that can't be explained without him. In fact, everything he made, you could say that about, including the planets. What's interesting is there's a guy named Dr. Humphreys. He predicted back in the 80s that if you went out to this planet, we would in fact find magnetism. And he was right. How did he make his prediction? What was his model? Just the Bible. He said, if it was made that long ago, we'd probably find magnetism still remnant. And lo and behold, they found it. It was confirmed just recently.
Yeah.
The other thing is that magnetism is decaying at a rapid rate. Its half-life is about 320 years. Okay, so where it's at right now, you can run this clock back. There's a maximum, there's a limit to how much magnetism there can be. You're not going to get way out there in deep history, hundreds of thousands, millions of years at all. You're far from it. So quick summary, evolution versus Mercury. Okay, evolution says it's a small planet. It should have a low gravitational field and a low density. Reality, just the opposite is true. It's a small planet. It cooled quickly, according to them. There's no molten core. Therefore, there's no dynamo, and there's no magnetic field. But of course, we just talked about the fact that there was one. The core must be iron sulfide, thus allowing the planet to cool slowly. The problem is it shouldn't be there because it contradicts the nebula theory. Now, moving on to the next thing, Venus. Venus has some similar problems, okay? It has a similar composition to Earth according to evolution and mass, because they say, well, this is what we'd predict, given that they are in about the same place, they're the same size, they form at the same time, that's what we should find. The reality is they're quite opposite. Earth has a magnetic field, and guess what? Venus just doesn't. We've checked. It's not there. It should be. It's just like us, but it's not there.
Yeah.
Apparently, it's millions of years old, too, which means that there should be lots of erosion, wear, and tear. And by the way, it's about 900 degrees up there. So the rate for erosion is actually supposed to be quicker and easier because it's a softer composition. The rocks up there, if you were to push on them, would basically bend a little bit, right? As compared with rocks that are cool where we're at. Mm-hmm. The problem is the surface up there looks extremely fresh. Okay. There's essentially very little sign of interference with it anywhere. And even evolutionists admit that. Okay. The rocks have sharp edges that are unworn all over the place. So if you had millions of years of erosion as this stuff going on, you should expect to find something that's much more smoothed out, especially at 900 degrees than we've currently got.
Yeah.
And if it's the result of the nebular theory, we go back to the conservation law of angular momentum, which we discussed in the first video, that says that objects that are, exploded off of a spinning object into a frictionless environment continue to rotate in the same orbit as the original mass. The problem is Venus is in retrograde. It spins backwards as compared with the Earth. They're literally on the same orbital path, but they're spinning in two separate directions. Mm-hmm. How is that possible? Well, I guess if God did it, it wouldn't be a problem at all. But if it happened through the accretion disk, then you've got a huge problem. Mm-hmm. Not ours to explain. We can just say, yeah, that's how he did it. He said he did some things for signs and for seasons. He did some things just to be beautiful. That's just what God does. Yeah. No problem there.
Yeah.
Why is it like that? Well, one theory is that a meteor hit it because there's no alternative. And when it hit it, it changed the composition and made everything look different. It probably took out a moon that might have existed. I mean, there's all of these dumb things that, we have no evidence for them happening other than that the Bible would be true if they didn't. Now, Earth is uniquely designed for life. Okay. Designed. For thus saith the Lord that created the heavens, God himself that formed the earth and made it. He hath established it. He created it not in vain. He formed it to be inhabited. I am the Lord, and there is none else. This was its purpose. Okay. Now it rotates at about 1,070 miles per hour. Okay. It's fast enough to prevent any, radical temperature changes, because if we faced the sun too long or, faced away from the sun too long, let's say you slowed it down by half, you'd have a boiling and a freezing problem all at the same time. Mm-hmm. Okay. We don't have that problem. We have just enough time at 24 hours to create, a livable environment. Not to mention, based on the Coriolis effect, if we spin too quickly, we're going to have violent windstorms that just blow everything apart. You wouldn't be able to survive here. Right. Mm-hmm. So it's spinning at just the right speed. Not to mention the axis of it is tilted just right to give us very moderate seasons, right? The summer, the winter, the fall, and the spring. The atmosphere on our planet is just thick enough to protect us from solar radiation, and it's thin enough to prevent a excessive greenhouse effect. Okay, so we've got just the right amount of atmosphere. The magnetic field that we have is there to protect us from solar winds and things like that. So essentially, if we didn't have it, we would be destroyed by the sun. And because we have it, we're not. The interesting thing is that our magnetic field is decreasing at a really fast rate. Okay, we've lost 14% of that energy just since 1829. For some perspective, it continually shrinks. How much bigger was it? Well, there's a limit to that too, just like there was on the other planets. And the answer is you can't just go back for millions of years. This is evidence that we're a young Earth, not an old Earth.
Right. And what's interesting too is that with evolution theory, they talk about the survival of the fittest. Well, for the example with Mercury, if evolution was all about surviving, then wouldn't it, speed up its spin so that's not, hundreds of degrees on one side and negative 200 on the other?
I guess if it had feelings or cared or self-replicated, it might.
Right, yeah.
Like usually we reserve those kinds of thoughts for like the actual things that repeat themselves in biology. It doesn't duplicate itself, certainly, but there's just a lot of stuff that absolutely doesn't make sense any other way than by creation.
Yeah.
And this is one of them. So what's unique about Earth especially should be kind of a no-brainer. It's that it has water, and it has a lot of it. And so you look at this and go, wait a second, this is one of the gases that shouldn't be here according to the nebula theory, because it's a gas too, and it's just going to vaporize and head out to the distant regions where it should have been some other kind of water planet out there or something, right? Yet, here it is. And if you look at the other planets, there's virtually no water at all. They have almost nothing on there. We're always looking for, hoping that it's somehow a sign of life. It has nothing to do with life. Let me tell you that. Mm-hmm. Life needs it to sustain, but it doesn't create anything. We'll get into that in a later episode. Mm-hmm. But we have tons of water here. You say, well, how did it get here then? They say, well, gosh, it couldn't have formed with the planet. Therefore, it came later. Oh, there we go. There's the answer. Oh, okay. So the planet formed first and the water came later. Where'd the water come from? They say comets. Okay. Comets, those are big balls of ice that are traveling through space, and they apparently hit Earth and they melted. And, here we have our oceans. Well, the problem is there's a couple things here. This is so stupid. The first one is they've gone out and measured these comets before with instrumentation to find out what the composition of that water is. And it contains a lot of deuterium, which is like heavy water, they call it. Pretty rare on Earth, but if correct me if I'm wrong here, somebody, hydrogen-3 isotope is what creates this particular heavy water. You wouldn't want to drink it. Okay, It's not good for you. But the point is we have very little of it on this planet, so apparently comets didn't contribute to the water sources that we have.
Yeah.
But I want to back up and I want to ask whoever said this, I'd like to ask them, so tell me how this worked. Was it kind of like, a creator, for lack of better words, took his comet machine gun and aimed it just at this planet and missed all the rest? Why did they all seemingly choose just this planet? Of all the things they could have collided with on the way, they missed and missed and missed again. Okay. All through the plane of the ecliptic. You know what? Let's just say they came from the top down. I don't care. They made it onto this planet somehow as it was orbiting, if you're coming from the top down perspective, and just happened to hit it every single time, but didn't take it out of orbit, and it's just floating along just fine.
Yeah.
Yeah, it all hit this one. Sounds like, I don't know, a creator, for lack of better words. Or he just put the water here like he said he did, and that's how it actually happened. Forget the comets.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. It's all nonsense. And it doesn't take much more than, say, a first grade education to figure it out. This is coming from professors who have a highly exalted view of themselves, the ones who profess themselves to be wise have become fools. So evolution says the water shouldn't be here because we're too close to the sun. It's nonsense. We have a ton of it, and it's abundant on this planet, and it's what we need for our existence. God created this thing to be inhabited. Revelation 10:5, it says, and the angel which I saw stand upon the sea and upon the earth lifted up his hand to heaven and swear by him that liveth forever and ever, who created heaven and the things therein are, and the earth and the things that therein are, and the sea. He created that too, just a note, and the things which are therein, that there should be time no longer. Okay, so he's saying right here, no, I created the sea. I didn't send comets. Somebody else didn't figure. I did this. That's all there is to it. Pretty simple.
Yeah.
Last week, I talked about the canopy theory, and I lost my train of thought along the way. And I asked the question out loud, where'd the canopy go? But then I don't think I really adequately answered the question. I talked about the flood. The answer is it's probably just here in the water. Okay, if it was once ice, it came down. What's interesting is there's an axial tilt of like 24.5 degrees that we have from the plane of the ecliptic, which is the actual plane that all these planets are orbiting on. And this little tilt that we have, if you were to look at the very tip of it, it actually wobbles just slightly. Okay. So if you take a top and you spin it and you flick it, it'll actually wobble, but then it'll straighten back out over a few seconds. And if you were to graph that wobble over time, you'd see a zigzag pattern on a sheet of paper until it came back to virtually center. You can actually mathematically trace backwards on that zigzag pattern to find out when an object was first flicked, because there's a certain point where you flick it so hard that it doesn't wobble, rather it just changes its rotation direction altogether. Mm-hmm. We were apparently flicked. Okay. And if we look at this, it doesn't actually, I can't tell you the exact date, but it appears that we were flicked in the last, few thousand years, recent history. It's possible that when the canopy came down with rain and whatever else was happening during that time, that it might have contacted the earth, and something large enough to do that might have caused the wobble that we have. So just one possible explanation. The other thing I want to point out is before it happened, we talked about the nostrils of a brontosaurus and how it might have breathed in an atmosphere that was as dense as our atmosphere currently is, which just isn't dense enough for it to exist. And I mentioned that its nostrils are the same size of a horse. Just to be clear, I was referring to the nostrils of a horse, not the horse itself, because those would be pretty big nostrils. We don't find evidence for that, but just want to clear it up because I had another chance.
Yeah.
We're going to move along. We're going to talk about the moon next. But before I go any further, I want to point out that probably the best resource I've ever found with anything related to astronomy, if you guys want to do your own homework and find out exactly who it is, who I get most of my information from, it's a guy named Spike. And I don't know if I'm saying this right, Psarris. Okay, it's spelled P-S-A-R-R-I-S. First name Spike. Okay, this guy was a NASA military space program guy, was an atheist, total evolutionist, old Earth kind of guy, was challenged along the way about what he believed, and has come full circle just like I did. And now he teaches on this very subject. So if you Google him, YouTube him, he's got lots of videos. They're free about the created solar system, the universe, all that kind of stuff, go into a whole lot more depth than we will today. But the next thing I want to talk about was the moon. And the moon is kind of unique here for Earth. The question, of course, is where did it come from? And there's a few competing hypotheses apart from, biblical creation that try to take credit. The first is what they call fission theory. And the idea is that it's actually a glob of the Earth. Okay, so the Earth was spinning. It was hot back in the day. And since it was hot, it basically had this little section that kind of balled off of it as, the rotational centrifugal force pulled on it. And then it continued to spin in a particular direction consistent with the original mass and orbits us. Well, if that was true, we should expect to find that moon rock and Earth rock are similar. The thing is, the moon is virtually anemic if compared to us. It's extremely, the amount of iron that we have here is far greater than what they have there. So they said, well, that doesn't work. It's not even made of something similar. Not to mention the sand on this moon that was created for us has a reflective property to it. That's why when the sun gives light to it, it reflects back on us and does a good job. Mm-hmm. On top of that, it just has some features that you might find suspicious if it weren't created. For example, it's 400 times smaller than the sun, but the sun is 400 times farther away than the moon, which is why one can eclipse the other, and they appear to be exactly the same size when that happens. That's a pretty amazing coincidence, if you ask me. The fission theory, of course, is ridiculous. The Earth rocks and the moon are extremely different, okay? One of the other problems with it is that the Earth would have to spin so quickly for this glob to break off of it that it would have to spin at roughly one revolution every 2.6 hours. The problem is you're going to have tidal friction, okay? Mm-hmm. And when this occurs, you're going to be scrubbing so hard that the increase of temperature is going to be enough to boil off the water we have. Okay. And that water is still here. The nebula theory says, well, maybe the moon formed in similar patterns that everything else did, right? You just had these gases, they coalesce, and here we have it. Of course, it's defeated for the same reasons. They're not the same. It's a huge problem for physics because they just don't stick together like that. And the moon's core is extremely dissimilar proportionally to that of the Earth. So if they were created in the same time and place with the same elements, you'd expect at least those things to be alike, and yet they're nothing alike. The final theory they had was what they call capture theory. And the idea here is that the moon came from some other place, and when it traveled by the Earth, it just got a little bit of its magnetic field and got pulled into an orbit and stayed there. The problem is you'd have an elliptical orbit if that was the case. And the other thing is it would accelerate towards the Earth, and if it didn't collide with it, it would go past it and just continue on its way. There's no way that this thing just suddenly becomes part of a perfect circle, right? There are a lot of occasions you'll see videos online, people describe these things, and they have a very convincing model they've created in a computer. Going back to our very first episode, I always ask people, tell yourself, ask yourself, am I seeing a picture, or am I meaning a drawing, someone's imagination, or am I seeing an actual photograph of something that happened, right? When it comes to the march of man, this whole evolutionary theory, you'll never see fossils that have, intermediary links between one thing and another. Mm-hmm. There's tons of drawings of it. There's tons of imaginary ideas of what it might have looked at. The same thing is true with computer modeling. Okay. Just because you can model something in a computer does not necessarily mean that it happened that way. I can make it do all kinds of things. I can tweak the physics over and over and over again until it looks exactly like what I want to see. So the problem they have is this. They say, well, the capture theory doesn't work. What would have caused this thing to stop in just the right place in orbit? Well, of course, the large impact hypothesis, because again, there's no other explanation apart from the Bible, and we're not going to stick with that. We need the moon. Okay. The moon's orbiting around us at a particular speed and a particular distance where it's churning the oceans at just the right rate to prevent them from becoming stagnant. If it spun any closer to us, the problem is the gravitational pull would be so severe that it would just literally wipe a tidal wave over the face of the Earth all the time. There has to be a limit to this. If you go too far away, it doesn't churn it enough. This is all, a fine-tuned environment for life. The other thing is the moon is moving a little farther away from us every year, okay? Its recession is also slowing down just slightly, which means it was once moving faster as it got away from us. But if you run the clock backwards, it would be actually touching 1.5 billion years ago. Okay, these things just don't match up with the models that they created. Mm-hmm. We could go on, guys. Talk about Mars. There's issues with that. Large impact hypothesis, of course, solves that problem. Jupiter. It's just everything you see. It's glorifying God, and they've got to come up with some different kind of scenario. If we look just briefly at Jupiter, Jupiter has a number of moons that go around it. We got Io, Europa, Ganymede, Callisto, and they've each got these incredible dissimilarities. Okay, Io is extremely small, yet it's volcanically active. Okay, this thing shouldn't still be hot going off all the time, and yet it is. Europa has a core. Some of them don't. Europa is the smoothest body in the entire solar system, and it's very icy, and it's close to Callisto. Okay, Callisto is the most heavily cratered object, whereas the other ones near it don't have any of that. God chose apparently carefully which things would get cratered, which ones didn't. All this stuff is just literally his handiwork. And if you look at Ganymede, this one has a magnetic field that shouldn't be there, just like the rest. Everything is in violation of the evolutionary theory. What's really amazing, though, and I hope you guys can go online and find pictures of this, Ganymede has something unique about it. There are places on it that appear to have been brush-stroked by a paintbrush, okay? No idea what caused this. No one has any theory about it. You've got all these cratered areas, and then all of a sudden you have a place where there's just a smooth, wide section that looks as if someone just brush-stroked it through. And since that brushstroke passed through, there have been craters that have hit it. Their thing is there's nothing on the surface of that. There's no water. There's nothing up there that would have actually dragged across it and maintained its width like a paintbrush anywhere in sight. And it just goes all over the place. Yeah. God's handiwork is just meant to be impressive. If you look at Saturn, you look at its rings, there's millions of them. And they should be covered in dust by now, but they're bright and they're shiny. They haven't been floating around forever. Okay, you give it enough time and they will not look bright and shiny anymore just because they've collided with enough space dirt, right? Given enough time, some of these rings should fall in towards it and other ones should be flung away. The fact is we're seeing this thing really kind of an embryo, right? This is a new moment for it along with everything else, and these things haven't happened yet. And if you look at certain pictures, there are literally spoke lines going through the various rings. On top of that, some rings are braided, two spinning around each other and coming back into contact as if there was never a break in the line. This is all over. There's things there that just cannot be explained any other way. On top of that, there are space geysers. That's correct. And I'm going to say this probably incorrectly, guys. I'm just going to spell it. You guys look it up. Enceladus. Okay, this is one of Saturn's moons. There are geysers spraying out hot water into space. This thing hasn't cooled down yet. It hasn't been going on forever. Psalm 8, 3-4 says, when I consider thy heavens, the work of thy fingers, the moon and the stars, which thou hast ordained, what is man that thou art mindful of him, and the son of man that thou visitest him? Take a look out there sometime, guys. Look at Hubble, okay? Look at what it's taking pictures of. Look at Deep Field, okay? If you guys aren't familiar with Hubble Deep Field, they basically focused on a spot where there was seemingly nothing, which would be the size of a grain of sand held at arm's length as far as the section of, space they're going to zoom in on. And they stared at it for days. And you know what they found out there? Millions of galaxies in a place where they said, well, we've never seen anything out there before, right? This just goes on forever. The complexity is beyond our understanding. Anyway, I hope this gives you guys some idea of the evidence that God has left behind for your own good, right? To help you, to help you believe, right? Some of these things really have no bearing on our daily life. These facts aren't things that you knew moments before you read about this, listen to this, whatever. And when you find them out, you just go, okay, that's good information. What am I to do with it? Glorify your creator with it. That's what it's doing. Okay. Yeah. That's what it's doing. It's the stars ovation. They're telling you, hey, stand up and cheer. This is the God who created you. And there's evidence for it. You don't need to feel ashamed of what, you believe. You don't need to back down to your professor in college or anybody who's trying to give you a bad grade because you don't see it their way. Mm-hmm. Stand your ground. God has given you sufficient evidence to do that without any shame.
Yeah. Yeah. No, Gavin, I love as you're talking, just the little pieces, the little evidences that we have seen. It's just so evident that God is like, almost doing that on purpose to say, here's my hand in creation. Because if evolution were true, then, a lot of things would be similar or same in order, but God just changes it up to say, here I am. So obvious. And that's super cool. And we can use that to just glorify God, as you said. And that's the main reason for it. Yeah. Listeners, we hope this can encourage you. Christians, if you are believers, we hope this can encourage and strengthen your faith even. And if you are an evolutionist, we hope that we're able to challenge your beliefs and change them because we want you to come know the truth as we have. So, listeners, thank you for joining us on this episode of the It Stands Written podcast. And Lord willing, we will see you on the next one.